I like this answer. Listen to this. Jesus said, you're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. There's no such cause and effect here. Look instead for what God could do. Now, the first time I ever read this in Message translation, I thought, man, that is a good way to say it. That is exactly what happened. This shows a keen understanding of human psychology, because this is exactly what we do. And what Jesus is saying here is you're losing your focus on what's important if you do that. If you start saying, well, I got to find somewhere to fix the blame. Who's to blame? He said, you're not looking in the right direction then. Don't look for someone to blame. He said, it's nobody's fault. Don't look for a fault anywhere. But the thing to do is to look to God. What can God now do? See, Jesus doesn't even answer their question about why it happened. He doesn't even answer that. He doesn't even address that. He doesn't address why did it happen. He doesn't even deal with that. But he says instead, here we are, let's see what God can do. That's basically what he's saying. And the rest of the story, as you know, Jesus spat on the ground. He made clay of the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man and told him to go wash it off in the pool of Siloam. And then the man came again seeing. And it's a very interesting story, but that's all we're going to read of it right there. And I think it's interesting. A lot of people wonder, why did he do that? Why didn't he just lay his hands on? Why did he make clay out of the, spit on the ground and this, mud in his eyes, and then tell him to go wash it off? I think, this is just my guess now. Now I'm just giving you my opinion. I think the reason he told him to do that is because he wanted that man to wash off, metaphorically, wash off the past. And that's kind of what he's saying to the disciples here. Don't worry about who sinned. Don't worry about why it happened. We just need to look instead about what God can do. And what did God send Jesus to do in this situation? To bring healing. To bring healing, to make things better. See, he doesn't come into our lives to make things worse and to put on us a lot of heavy burdens and duties and obligations and hard things. He comes to make things better. And I think he put the clay on the man's eyes just so that he would metaphorically wash away what was past, and wash it away and let the past be the past and walk on with God. That's my take on it. Now let's look at another passage I like in Romans chapter 8. And this is a very familiar verse, verse 28. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. In fact, I want to back up a little bit. Let's back up to verse 26. We'll get the context here. This is Romans 8:26. This is actually a very lovely thought here that Paul brings us. He says, likewise the Spirit helpeth our infirmities. Infirmity means weakness. The fact that we're weak is what it means. The Spirit also helpeth our infirmities, for we know not what we should pray for as we ought. But the Spirit itself maketh intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. And then he says in verse 27, he that searches the hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because he makes intercession for the saints according to the will of God. What he's saying is the Holy Spirit knows our hearts and knows how to make the connection, if I can say it that way, between us and God. And he's saying we don't always know how to pray and express what's really in our hearts. And that's a profound thought, but it's very true, isn't it? He's saying that the Spirit helps us with that. And back up to verse 26 again, Phil, just for a second. Notice that he says, likewise the Spirit helpeth our infirmities. In other words, he helps us in our weakness. He doesn't say that he takes over or does it for us, but he helps us. He's a helper. So, this corresponds to what Jesus said about the Holy Spirit. I will send to you, the King James says, another comforter. That word comforter means helper. Comforter is good, but he's a helper. He is sent into our lives to be a helper. And here Paul says he helps us with our weakness, because we don't know how to express the deepest things that are in our heart. Okay, now, let's get 27 again. He that searches the hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because he makes intercession for the saints according to the will of God. Now, verse 28 reads this way in the King James translation. He says, we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. Now again, I mentioned a while ago, casual readers of the Bible. This is another one. Casual readers of the New Testament, without thinking about it, will take a verse like this and say, well, everything that happens in life, well, God has some mysterious plan, and sort of attributing everything that happens to God. But we just read from James that only good and perfect things come from God. He didn't say the good and the bad. He said good and perfect things come from God. I think a better way to understand this verse, I found this in Martin Luther's commentary on Romans. Now, Martin Luther lived 100 years, more or less, before this was written, before the King James translation. The King James translation was made in about 1611. Martin Luther lived in the early part of the 1500s. So he didn't have the King James translation to color his thinking about this. And his commentary on Romans is a commentary, it's the transcript, more or less, that his teaching that he gave as he was teaching in the Wittenberg Seminary. And I was reading about this chapter. In fact, I just got it out and read it this morning to refresh my memory. It's sort of a transcript of Martin Luther teaching a class in the seminary about how to understand Romans. And when it came to this verse, said Martin Luther then reads from the Greek. In those days, you had to be a theologian, you had to know how to read Greek, had to read Hebrew. So he had his Greek New Testament, and he read, and there was a little string of Greek words there. And, it was all, like we say, it was all Greek to me. But then here is his on-the-spot literal translation. I wrote it down for you. Listen to this. See if you think this changes the sense of it. In all things, God works together with us for good. Now that's a little different than the wording here. In all things, God works together with us for good. Now what that's saying is not that God controls everything that happens, but in everything that happens, God is working with us for good. Now, I like that better because that fits with what we just read about the Holy Spirit. How we don't know how to pray as we ought, but the Holy Spirit helps our infirmities. He helps us. And it says here, likewise, he says, in all things, God works with us for good. Now, the thought is this. God's not controlling all the bad things that happen, but here's the good part. In everything that happens, He's with you. He doesn't abandon you. He doesn't leave you, and He works with us for good. No matter what happens, now this is a good thought here, no matter what happens, He's able to bring good. He's able to work good for it. Now, there's another passage that this reminded me of, and it's way back in Genesis. Phil, how hard is it to turn back to Genesis? Chapter 50. And verse 20. Genesis chapter 50. It's right at the last chapter of Genesis, I believe. And this is the story of Joseph. And you might know the story of Joseph. Kids all learned it, of course, in the Sunday school. And just to refresh your memory about Joseph, Joseph had some brothers, and the brothers were jealous of Joseph because he was favored by his father, and he had a coat of many colors, and he began to have dreams. And he said, guess what, guys, I had a dream where these sheaves of wheat you had all these sheaves of wheat, and they all bowed down to my sheaf of wheat, and then the sun and the moon and the stars all bowed down to me. And they understood what he meant by that. He's saying, all of you bowed down to me. Well, that made him mad. What do you mean you had a dream about all of us bowing down to you? And so if you know the story of Joseph, they betrayed him, and they tricked him, and they threw him in a pit, and sold him into slavery. Sometimes people read the story of Joseph and try to identify themselves with Joseph. The story of Joseph is not for us to identify ourselves with. He's a type of Christ. It's a picture of Jesus, how Jesus was betrayed by his brethren and thrown into a pit, you might say. And how he was sold into slavery. And you know the story of Joseph, that they sold him into slavery, and so the people that bought him took him back, and this guy named Potiphar put him in his household, and Joseph was faithful, and he rose in the ranks of the servants. And then Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him, and he resisted her, so she lied about him, and that got him thrown into prison. And now he's in prison. It's like everything's going wrong, and the baker and I think two of the king's servants were in the prison with him, and he interpreted their dreams. And when one of them got restored to power, he told the king, King, you've had a dream, and there's a guy in prison named Joseph, and he can interpret your dream. So the king got him out of, I'm telling you the Reader's Digest version of the story. And so the king got him out of prison to interpret my dream, and I saw 7 fat cows, and then 7 skinny cows, and the 7 skinny cows ate the 7 fat cows. What could that mean? And he knew it must mean something important. And Joseph said, well, it means there's going to be 7 years of plenty, and then there's going to be 7 years of famine. And you better start saving up during the years of plenty, so you'll have enough to get you through the years of famine. The king said, man, that is really good interpretation. I'll just put you in charge of it. So now he comes from the prison to being in charge of everything over Egypt. And so when the 7 years of famine come, all of Joseph's brothers and his mother and father are back in Canaan. They're starving, and there's no crops, and nothing's working right. So they go to Egypt to buy grain because Joseph, was sent ahead of them. By all these trials and all this trouble that he went through, Joseph was in a position where he had put in store enough to help them in their trouble. So they come to Egypt to buy the grain, and so they don't know who Joseph is. It's a long, kind of interesting, complicated story. So finally Joseph reveals himself to them, and they all bow down before him just like he'd seen in his dream. And notice what he says here. Did we find it here?